Thank you very much for joining us today for another in the GreyLearning Webinar Series. Today we're going to be talking about optimal HDR with Nik HDR Efex Pro. There are a variety of tools out there available for producing HDR interpretations of images, and consistently I'm finding that Nik HDR Efex Pro is generally right at the top of my list, if not in first place for every image, oftentimes maybe second place, but one of my go-to tools for working with high dynamic range images. I'm Tim Gray. I'm a photographer and an educator, author, etc., and I'm really passionate about photography. And I take an interesting approach. Well, maybe it's not so interesting to photographers because it seems like everyone on this webinar today is in agreement with me. We had a poll right before the webinar began asking how realistic you want your HDR images to appear. And the overwhelming majority, about 84% at last check, said they want the photo to look as realistic as possible. And that's exactly my personal approach. We had 1% of the audience saying that they wanted no realism at all. Bring on the saturation. You know what sorts of images those are. Certainly in certain situations that works great, but more often than not, I find that I prefer an HDR image that doesn't at first glance look like an HDR image. Now, we're photographers, and so when we see an HDR image, even if it's done really well, there's a good chance we'll know it's an HDR because we're familiar with the capabilities and limitations of cameras, the nature of light, etc. But my overall goal is generally to make it as realistic as possible. You can take an image any direction you want. I'll show you some variations on a theme here as we move forward with optimal HDR using Nik HDR Efex Pro 2. Now, of course, HDR Efex Pro 2 is not operating in a vacuum. In fact, it works with other software as a plugin. Generally, it is possible to use HDR Efex Pro 2 as a standalone application, but there are some limitations there. So generally speaking, you will want to work with HDR Efex Pro as a plugin. In this case, I'll primarily be using Lightroom as my host application. We could also use Photoshop for that purpose. But first, let's talk about when I'm going to capture HDR and when I'm not going to capture HDR, and sort of, you might say, just a little bit of a philosophical approach. I saw that in the poll, again, the vast majority of you say that you want your HDR images to look realistic. Well, since HDR has this reputation as being hyper-realistic and oversaturated and way too much shadow detail, what are we capturing in the first place? Why are we using HDR? Well, for me, there are two key reasons. They're a little bit related, but the general idea is to maximize the amount of information available to me in an image. That doesn't necessarily mean that I keep all of that information, but that I have it available. It doesn't mean that I have a flat, low contrast image so that I can see every little bit of shadow detail. It might be a very high contrast image, but the point is I want that detail available so that I can make my own creative decisions when I'm working on my photos after the capture. So here's a somewhat typical example of why I essentially would say that I almost need HDR. When I say need, you can't see me doing air quotes, but there are air quotes around that. Need is a subjective term. I don't necessarily need, under all circumstances, HDR, even when the light in the scene, the contrast range in the scene, exceeds my camera's capabilities. If we take a look at a somewhat more extreme example here, let's take a look at this image and we'll see that the highlight detail is clipped. So this is a good example of where the light available, the contrast range, the tonal range, the dynamic range in the scene exceeded my camera's capabilities. If we take a look at the histogram, we'll see that the left end of that histogram goes right up against the edge of the display, meaning the darkest pixel in this image is very nearly black. But if we go take a look at the right side, we'll see that we've actually lost highlight detail. And so I'm clipping the highlight detail while retaining the shadow detail. And so again, over on the left-hand side, I'm right up against the dark edge. I've almost but not quite gotten to the point where I've clipped shadow details. Over on the right side, you can see that I have indeed clipped highlight details. So with this photograph, I have information in my shadows, but I have lost detail in the highlights. So up in the dome here on the church, you can see that I've lost some detail, for example. So all I need to do is darken up that exposure a little bit, maybe down to about there, And now I am retaining highlight detail. So in the dome here, you can see that I've got highlight detail pretty well preserved. If we look at the histogram, maybe a tiny bit of clipping, but considering some of the bright lights, that's probably not a problem at all. But I've lost shadow detail in the process. So here, again, the dynamic range, the difference between the darkest areas and the lightest areas of the scene go beyond my camera's capabilities. Let's address the second reason, though. Let's just assume, for sake of argument, that with this photo, I actually did not have any shadow clipping. In this case, I have a tiny bit of highlight clipping and a little bit of shadow clipping. Let's see if we can compensate for that a little bit. We'll pull that white point back, and we can bring a fair amount of that back, but not all of that information. And the black point, actually, I'm able to recover that. The magic of raw capture, I actually have more dynamic range available in an individual capture than I initially realized. But it still looks a little bit dark, so I'll simply brighten up my shadow detail. Well, let's go ahead and brighten up the exposure a little bit, and maybe right about there, if we back off, well, I can't back off the whites anymore, so I'm running into a little bit of a limitation. But let's forget about that overall limitation in terms of tonal range for just a moment. If I zoom in on some of the darker shadow areas, and I'm actually going to exaggerate this, you might say, by turning off my noise reduction adjustment, by brightening up those shadows, I'm bringing out the noise. If you look in the brightly lit areas of the scene, or the relatively brightly lit areas of the scene, we don't see anywhere near as much noise. And there's two reasons for that. Number one, noise is essentially the opposite of information. And in the context of a photographic image, noise is the opposite of light, you might say. Essentially, when there's not enough light, the camera is trying to see the light that's hardly there, that's just barely there. It amplifies that signal, and we run into noise as a result. Noise is also more visible in the shadows just because there's better contrast there. We can still see there is some noise in the bright areas. It's just not as easy to see as it is when it is set against a nice dark area. But the point here is that even if I felt that this image was adequate in terms of the overall dynamic range, if I'm going to open up a lot of shadow detail, I do not want to use a single exposure, because that single exposure is going to be very, very dark in those shadow areas. When I brighten up those shadows to where I'm happy with them, where I feel that I have enough detail, I'm also going to be bringing out a lot of noise. Compare that with a brighter image. If I zoom in over here on the right-hand side, then you'll see that I have much less noise. I'll go ahead and turn off my detail controls there, and we'll see much less noise in this image than in the preceding image. So there we see a comparison between those two, the same area brightened up to, approximately the same value. The darker exposure that got brightened has much more noise than the bright image. This is part, by the way, of that expose to the right concept, meaning expose your image as bright as possible in order to maximize detail and minimize noise. So this gives us a very clear example of exactly that. If we keep our shadows dark and brighten them up, we're bringing out noise. And so even in a situation where I don't necessarily need HDR, let's take a look at this photo, for example. I have not clipped my highlights. I actually have even a little bit of room there. I could brighten up this image just a little bit more, maybe by about a half of a stop or a third of a stop. And I've got good detail in my highlights. I might have clipped a little bit on the shadows, but not too terribly much. Let's take a look. Very little in the way of shadow clipping. Right about there is going to work pretty well in terms of setting that black point so that I'm retaining as much detail as I possibly can in the overall image. But of course, I still feel that the overall impression of this scene, not so good. I want to bring out more highlight detail and more shadow detail. So for example, I might reduce the value for highlights, and if you pay attention to the sky in particular, you'll see that even though I did not clip the whites, I was still losing a little bit of apparent detail, but by pulling down the highlights, I'm able to get more information there. I can then brighten up my shadows, and look at that. I've got an image that is working pretty well with a single exposure. And yet, my preference in a situation like this, relatively high contrast, but within the capabilities of my camera to capture that full range, I will still capture an HDR image. I will still capture a couple of brighter exposures so that now I have better, higher quality, less noisy shadow information. So again, even in situations where your camera might be able to keep up with the range of light, you might want to capture an HDR version of the image in order to ensure that you have better detail, better quality in those shadows in particular. So let's talk about that capture. I think most photographers have gotten at least a little bit familiar with HDR capture. There are two basic ways that you might approach HDR captures. In concept, it's very simple. We want to have a dark exposure, a medium exposure, and a bright exposure, you might say. In other words, we want an image that is dark and therefore preserves highlight detail, and we want an image that is bright and therefore preserves shadow detail, but we need a little bit of overlap in between. We can't just jump from our darkest exposure all the way to our brightest exposure and expect the HDR software to assemble everything in between, to make sense of what falls in between. Many photographers will use a one-stop difference between each of their exposures. Generally speaking, to be perfectly honest, that's a bit of overkill. You don't need to get that close an exposure compensation between each of your frames. 2 stops will be adequate. What you'll want to do, obviously a tripod is helpful, but essentially what we're trying to do is lock in all of our settings except for, generally speaking, our shutter speed, so that we're using the same ISO setting, the same shutter speed. Overall, same camera settings, lockdown, manual mode ideally, on a tripod, and then we can adjust our shutter speed, the exposure time. So here we have a 3,000th of a second, and then down to a 7/50th of a second, which would be a 2-stop brighter exposure, and then down to a 1/80th of a second, 2 more stops. I generally won't go beyond 2 stops separation between, but 1 stop is not necessary. So 2-stop separation would be perfectly fine in terms of adjusting your shutter speeds per each. Now, it is also possible to use automatic exposure bracketing and to capture those individual frames in a burst sequence without even using a tripod. You can use a handheld exposure, set a timer, a 2-second timer on your camera, set exposure bracketing. Many cameras now have 5 or 7 captures available as part of that bracketing. Some of the older models only 3. So what I would say is if you're capturing sets of 3, separate by 2 stops each, and use that timer mode so that you can hold steady, trigger the exposure, wait the 2-second timer, and then boom, boom, boom. Those captures are taken in sequence as quickly as possible by your camera. And as you'll see in a moment, we do have the option to assemble those images later and to align them properly. So here's yet another example where if we take a look at the basic exposure, it doesn't look like I was losing much in the way of detail. I could probably preserve that information, but I have more flexibility by using HDR. So capturing an image that definitely retains all the detail and the bright highlights, the clouds in this case. Capturing an image that retains a fair amount of shadow detail. Here, maybe not going quite as far as I might normally go to brighten up those shadows, and then an exposure that falls in between. And if I assemble all of that into an HDR image, you can see something like this where I have more information overall available, so I can choose how much highlight detail, how much shadow detail, how much contrast I want overall. So let's take a look at the actual process, the workflow essentially for creating an HDR interpretation of an image. I'm actually going to start off using Lightroom's built-in capability. I know today we're talking primarily about Nik HDR Efex Pro, but let's take a look at what Lightroom is capable of, and you'll see some of the deficiencies, but also some of the advantages when it comes to working with the software that's built in now in Photoshop. So I'm going to go ahead and let's go back to the original version of this image, and I'll select all of these photos. So here's a sequence of images, obviously captured in Rome of the Vatican, and so we've got a series of images, exposures that are brighter and brighter. Now, one of the issues that we run into with HDR imagery, assembling a high dynamic range image, is that we have to capture multiple photos. And from one frame to the next, things might change in the frame. In this case, we have the Tiber River down below. There's obviously movement of that water. The exposures are longer exposures, so there's going to be some blurring of that movement. There's probably going to be some cars crossing the bridge, etc. That's actually one of the areas where Lightroom doesn't do a great job in assembling HDR images. But let's take a look at this example, and you'll see the workflow for using an HDR sequence here. But as long as we're at it, let's go ahead and turn on AutoSync. I have AutoSync enabled. I could also apply adjustments to all of my individual exposures. So here, for example, I take my individual original raw captures, and I've just turned on AutoSync with all of those images selected, and I choose the black and white treatment, just as an example. Now we can see an obvious change from color to black and white. These are all obviously non-destructive adjustments here in the context of the develop module, but now I want to take these individual photos and assemble them into a single version that contains lots of information so that I can then map that information, that tremendous tonal range contained in my high dynamic range image, map it down to what we normally work with for a photographic image. So I'll go up to the photo menu and then choose Photo Merge, followed by HDR. This is a new feature, by the way. Lightroom 6 or later, or Lightroom CC, will take all of those images now, and they're being processed by Lightroom, so it's taking the individual raw captures and generating a preview of the final result. Now, up at the top right, you'll see I have auto align turned on, so even if I had shot handheld, in this case I'm using the longest exposure is 15 seconds, that certainly was not handheld, but even on a tripod, I prefer to have the auto align option turned on. So if you're shooting handheld, then that'll help to make sure any movement of the camera, of the photographer, will be, to the extent possible, corrected for by aligning those individual frames. But even on a tripod, sometimes you'll see very subtle shifts. Maybe if you didn't turn off image stabilization or some little movement, whatever the case might be, you might have a little bit of movement of the camera, and so that'll help to compensate for any of that movement. The Autotone checkbox just means that we want Lightroom to apply a basic set of adjustments automatically. We'll be able to adjust. Remember, Lightroom's develop module is non-destructive, and so I can always come back and refine those adjustments. It just gives me a good starting point, as you'll see in a moment. And then deghosting. So I mentioned deghosting. Even though I was on a tripod, the camera anyway was on a tripod, and I'm capturing a sequence of images, being very careful not to move the camera, etc., there's still some movement within the scene. Cars crossing the bridge, water flowing underneath the bridge, etc. The deghosting allows me to compensate for that. So I can choose low, medium, or high. I'll go ahead and use the low setting here. Whichever setting I choose, then I'll see a red overlay on the image indicating which areas of the photo have movement by Lightroom's estimation, and therefore which areas are going to be processed to try to compensate for that movement. So let's just assume that we were photographing a statue and there is a bird on top of that statue and the bird is moving from one frame to the next. What deghosting tries to do is to only include the pigeon once. And it'll find the one that seems to be the sharpest or the best exposed or what have you. There's actually an option for us with Nik HDR Efex Pro to actually choose which frame to use. But that way it's hopefully only including one version of that pigeon. So let's see what our merge option is going to do here. So I'll go ahead, I've set my settings. You notice that I can turn off that ghost overlay if I want to see the image without the overlay. And now I merge the images together. And while we're waiting for that to process, I see there is a question from an attendee wondering why I would convert this photo to black and white. Now, I suspect that the underlying question was really, hey Tim, this image looked tremendous in color, so why would you convert it to black and white, giving up all of that wonderful color information? And the answer is, I do not have a good reason for converting this image to black and white. While I do have many photos that I think work very well in black and white, this is not one of them. And I actually, part of the reason that I like this photo, part of the reason that I captured this scene is because I love the way the color comes out at night from this viewpoint. And so I absolutely should not have converted to black and white. So in this case, I was using that synchronization as an example, showing you that you could apply a series of adjustments to all of the individual captures in order to use that as a basis of an HDR image. In this case, perhaps that was not the best example because, as pointed out by the very astute attendee, why on earth would I take out the color from this image? That was a mistake. I should not have done that. But guess what? Lightroom helps to protect me from myself, essentially. So even though I was using black and white as an example here, if I go back, this is my DNG, my HDR. This is the processed image. Lightroom took all of my 7 exposures, my raw captures, and assembled them into an individual high dynamic range image, but it didn't actually get rid of the color information. So I can go back to this essentially original interpretation. It took all of that detail from my original raw captures, but it did not sacrifice the color information. So I can go in and fine-tune the color. In this case, I think I might actually go down to my saturation and reduce the saturation for the yellows, because that was maybe a little bit too much. I do like the blues, so I might boost those just a little bit. And so you can see we've got a lot of flexibility, so pretty nice in terms of that workflow. However, let's zoom in a little bit, and you'll see that we did not get a very good result in terms of that deghosting capability. And so this is an example of why, or some of the shortcomings of Lightroom when it comes to assembling HDR images. Certainly, Lightroom does a good job with static images. The workflow is wonderful, but it's still not quite, I would say, ready for prime time in terms of quality assembling my HDR images, especially in the context of this deghosting feature. So let's take a look at using a workflow that revolves around HDR Efex Pro. And in fact, I think we'll initially switch to Adobe Bridge. And let's just take a look at the workflow using Bridge, which in turn means it will be using Photoshop, just so that I can illustrate both of the methods that you might use for accessing HDR Efex Pro. In Bridge, I can select my series of images. So here we have a single exposure, probably works just fine, but there's a lot of detail in the ceiling of the Pantheon here, and so I've got a series of exposures that I want to assemble. I'll go ahead and select all of those exposures. So click on the first exposure, hold the Shift key, and click on the last exposure, and then I'm going to go to the Tools menu, followed by Photoshop, and then, followed by Google. I'm thinking about Photoshop's HDR, which is also pretty good. But go to the Google menu and then merge to HDR Efex Pro 2. That will launch Photoshop if it wasn't already running, and that will bring up our dialog for working with Nik HDR Efex Pro. And so that brings up an option in this case, because I'm starting from Bridge and Photoshop, to confirm which files I want to include. And so I'll, in this case, don't need to do anything. I could confirm that those are the correct ones. I could open, but I'm ready to just move on to the merge dialog. And then once that merging, that basic preview is generated, then I'll have some additional options that are available to me in terms of how those images will actually get merged together. And so this first dialog that we're seeing, where we're able to choose the source files, that is something that we'll only see when we're using Photoshop as the starting point. But when I say using Photoshop as the starting point, what I really mean, frankly, is using Bridge, because that makes it much easier to select the individual images and then be able to assemble them in an HDR. So we can select the images, send them over to Photoshop, and essentially bypass Photoshop, you might say, and go directly into HDR Efex Pro. I see there was a question about using Lightroom 6. So if somebody is just getting started and just interested in learning more about the Nik Collection, I should hasten to point out that the Nik bundle, the Nik Collection from Google, is now absolutely free. So you can go to the Google website and get the Nik Collection for free. And when you download and install, you'll have available as a plugin, essentially, the Nik Collection, including HDR Efex Pro, in Photoshop as well as in Lightroom. If you update, there was just, for example, an update to Photoshop 2015.5. When that happens, when there's a major update, you will generally need to reinstall the plugins to make them available again. So if you don't have access to HDR Efex Pro, you might need to just download and reinstall. But also, if you've not yet used HDR Efex from Lightroom, HDR Efex Pro from Lightroom, there is a little twist on how you access that plugin. We'll see that in just a moment. So I'm actually not going to worry about this dialog inside of HDR Efex Pro. We'll cover this in just a moment. I'll just click Create HDR, and we'll see that from Photoshop, I'm able to assemble the individual images, my original raw captures, into an HDR, and then I can tone map. I'll talk more about those individual steps in just a moment. For now, I just want you to see that overall workflow and the result in the context of Photoshop, and then we'll switch over to Lightroom. So we have someone who's saying they want to be able to merge directly from Lightroom. Yes, absolutely, positively. That's exactly where we're going next in terms of working with HDR Efex Pro. And so I'll go ahead and just apply this change. But yes, we will take a look at the workflow inside of Lightroom where we don't need to use Photoshop and we don't need to use Adobe Bridge. We can just use Lightroom. So remember, Lightroom does have a built-in HDR capability. I would say, generally speaking, it's not quite as good as what we have available with Nik HDR Efex Pro. So you can see the HDR image was assembled here. I could apply some changes. We're not going to worry about the details here. I just wanted to show you that workflow because for the most part now I'm just going to use Lightroom as the basis of assembling my HDR images. So I'll quit Bridge, in fact, and we'll get back into Lightroom, and let's take a look at the process of assembling HDR images inside of Lightroom. And here, I'll go ahead and choose another viewpoint from Rome. I'll select those several images. Now, if you've used other plugins, you're probably familiar with going up to the photo menu and then choosing, for example, Edit In, and you can see that we have a variety of plugins, including plugins from the Nik Collection, available to me right here on the Photo Edit In menu. But you will not find HDR Efex Pro here because HDR Efex Pro has some special needs in terms of how files are sent to it. When we use other plugins, what's generally happening is our original capture, typically a raw capture, for example, is being sent as a TIFF file or as a Photoshop PSD file, depending on the plugin you're using. In other words, your raw capture is being processed into actual pixel values. To get the best results with HDR processing, you want to start with all of the information that your camera captured in every single one of your exposures, and so you want to send the original raw captures directly to the HDR processing software, in this case HDR Efex Pro. So when I select my multiple images, what I want to do is, instead of going to Photo Edit In, I need to export the original raw captures and send them to HDR Efex Pro. Fortunately, that's very easy to do because when you install the Nik Collection, HDR Efex Pro will be installed not as a preset, but as a plugin for the export module, essentially. In other words, a preset for the export feature. So instead of using that Photo Edit In menu, I'll go to the File menu and choose Export with Preset. Notice that I could also go into the export dialog directly. I could click the export button at the bottom of the left panel and open up that export dialog, choose the appropriate preset, and then send the images that way. But it's faster and easier to simply select your images, then go to the File menu, Export with Preset, and then choose, in this case, HDR Efex Pro, so that I'm sending my original raw captures to HDR Efex Pro. So I'll go ahead and choose that option, and you'll see that Lightroom is processing. Up at the top left, I've got 3 photos in this case being processed, being sent over to HDR Efex Pro, really just being processed in terms of exporting and sending over to HDR Efex Pro. Once again, you'll see this initial dialog. Now notice I don't need to see the dialog. I won't see, in this case, that dialog where I choose which images to include, because Lightroom already told HDR Efex Pro exactly which images, and the process just essentially starts automatically. So I don't need to worry about that additional dialog. I just go directly into my HDR Creation dialog here. So let's take a look at the settings here. Pretty straightforward, but this is a very important initial step in terms of creating the best HDR image. First off, at the top, you'll see a film strip, essentially, and this is where I can see my individual frames, the individual exposures that I'm assembling. I can see how many stops they're off by, etc. But I can also, notice at the top, Ghost Reference Image. I can choose which image should be my Ghost Reference Image. Remember, ghost reduction or de-ghosting, that is where HDR software is able to evaluate whatever changed from one frame to the next, not because the camera moved. that's a separate issue, but because something in the frame moves. So if we had a bird flying across the frame, it might be in a different position in the sky for each of my individual exposures. The ghost reference image lets us choose which image should be considered essentially the most important for deghosting. So again, let's assume a bird flying across the screen, and it's over on the left side in the dark image, it's in the middle in the right image, and it's over to the right in the brighter image. Well, now I can choose which version of that bird I want to show. Shall I show it on the left, the middle, or the right? But it's not just about positioning of that moving subject, but also about detail. And remember, we're blending exposures. Do I want the really, really dark version of the bird that's likely going to be a bit noisy? Do I want the very, very bright version of the bird where some of the highlight details might be lost? Generally speaking, for my ghost reference image, I want to choose the frame that represents the best standalone exposure. In other words, if you only took one picture, which one would you choose? That's probably your best ghost reference image. So the one that looks like the best normal exposure. Here I have an image that seems too dark, an image that seems too bright, and an image that looks pretty good, all things considered. So I'll set that ghost reference image based on that criteria, essentially. And then we'll take a look at the settings over on the right side here of our Create HDR options. Number one is alignment. Honestly, I just always leave this turned on. Even for images captured on a tripod, there is some degree of risk that the individual images won't line up perfectly. With this checkbox turned on, HDR Efex Pro will analyze those individual frames and make sure that everything lines up. So deghosting would refer to if the tree was moving in the breeze in the foreground. Alignment would deal with if the camera moved, one of these church steeples, for example, might be shifted just a little left in one of the frames and just a little right in another of the frames. So alignment is for essentially camera movement, and I want that turned on pretty much without exception. And then the ghost reduction is for movement within the frame, but honestly, I generally always want this turned on as well. Ghost reduction has gotten to be pretty good, I would say especially in HDR Efex Pro 2. To be perfectly honest, in the first version of HDR Efex Pro, the ghosting was not very good, and it caused me to never use HDR Efex Pro for images that had any degree of movement within the frame. But when the software was updated to version 2, that ghost reduction was improved tremendously, and so now I leave that turned on almost without exception, even for images where I don't think there's much movement, and then I will take a look at the 100% strength setting by default. Well, I'll talk about evaluating that in just a moment, but let's take a look at the chromatic aberration. I'll turn on that checkbox. Now, chromatic aberration, you're probably already familiar with. Essentially, that is little halos, colored halos, especially at high contrast areas, and it can be very problematic. We have this, magenta halo around an object, for example, and that is caused by a variety of factors. It's more commonly seen with wide-angle lenses, with less expensive lenses, but it can be seen with virtually any lens, any image in certain circumstances. So let's take a look at the effect there. I'll go ahead and click on the magnifying glass so I can zoom in. Notice I have a ghost reduction setting for my zoom and a chromatic aberration setting. So this is a loop that allows me to evaluate different areas of the image. So let's go take a look, for example, this church steeple. I'm zoomed in and I can pan around across the image, and I would say from a alignment and ghost reduction standpoint, everything looks pretty good. Let's go take a look at this tree that was probably moving a little bit in the breeze, and I don't see any ghosting. I'm seeing just leaves without ghosts of leaves around it. So I can evaluate and I could adjust, and I could honestly reduce my setting for ghost reduction or even turn ghost reduction off if I felt it wasn't necessary. There is a degree of risk that if you're trying to apply ghost reduction when there's no ghosting, that you might end up with artificial ghosting. This is sort of analogous to turning on image stabilization when you're on a tripod. It's possible that the image stabilization that's trying to stabilize the scene might introduce movement instead. So not a bad idea to evaluate and check, but again, in most cases I find that a setting of 100% works well for images where there had been at least some degree of movement. Then let's take a look at chromatic aberration. That really just gives me a smaller view, a closer view, a stronger zoom setting, and I can look closely. What I want to do is look at high contrast areas of the image and see if there's any chromatic aberration, and if so, make sure that my chromatic aberration checkbox is turned on, and then adjust my slider values. So let me go ahead and just take these to an extreme value, maybe something like that. So you can see now this sort of pinkish halo on the outside. You might be able to make out a kind of greenish yellow halo a little bit further in. If we shift that over in this direction, things get a little more purple. That's what we're trying to avoid. So if you see any chromatic aberration, of course, you want to adjust your sliders to minimize the effect. So right about there looks good for the blue-yellow slider. And taking a very close look right. And it's helpful to go through the extreme. So swing way to the right, way to the left. So here we start to see that cyanish green appearance versus that kind of reddish magenta. And right about there looks to be pretty good. So just a minimal adjustment needed in this case for that chromatic aberration. So a question from one of the attendees: if you're using lens correction, can you apply lens correction to your images beforehand? And the answer, of course, is yes. And even if you're using HDR within Lightroom, then of course it's less important. But yes, you can apply lens corrections, including chromatic aberration corrections, ahead of time if you prefer. But I do find that HDR Efex Pro does a good job of cleaning up that chromatic aberration in my images. All right, so that takes care of then this initial assembly. So we're taking multiple raw captures and assembling them into a huge image in terms of dynamic range, a tremendous range of tonal values, way beyond potentially what the camera was capable of. So first I'm assembling that information, kind of bringing all those tremendous range of tonal values together, but that goes beyond the capabilities of an image, you might say, in terms of how I map those tonal values. And so the second piece here, which we'll see in a moment, is in terms of mapping the individual values, mapping the overall huge dynamic range, the high dynamic range image, down to what you might call a normal photographic image. That's our tone mapping stage, which comes next. One question, by the way, whether or not chromatic aberration is constant within the frame. In other words, can I look at just one area of the frame and trust that that's adequate? And the answer, unfortunately, is no. We can see variable degrees of chromatic aberration based on contrast in the frame. You'll generally see more chromatic aberration out toward the edges, especially with a wide-angle lens. And so you do want to evaluate a few different areas and kind of strike a balance where you can minimize the overall appearance of that chromatic aberration in the frame. And then I'm seeing sort of a related question. One of the attendees is saying they are occasionally getting a white border around objects, roofs, trees, etc., especially in the sky. What can I do to eliminate that? Well, that comes in the next step. That's actually not chromatic aberration, if I'm understanding the question correctly. That's a halo effect. We'll see some examples of that momentarily. So I've told HDR Efex Pro how I want to process these base images, these raw captures, into an HDR result, a high dynamic range result. I'll go ahead and click the Create HDR button, and now HDR Efex Pro is performing step number 1. Now, just to compare, in Lightroom, when we merge HDR, we're creating a high-bit DNG image, which contains all of that high dynamic range information, and then we're using Lightroom's Develop module for the tone mapping of our image. With HDR Efex Pro, we're using two different pieces of software, you might say. We're using that, or two different steps anyway, with that software. We are initially assembling the individual raw captures into an HDR, and then we're mapping the range of tonal values based on what you might call a normal photographic image. So we're taking a huge range of tonal values and compressing them down into a normal range of tonal values, a normal photographic image, you might say. All right, so then we're able to tone map. So I have my assembled HDR and I'm ready to tone map this image so that I can produce the intended result. Here is where we run into some challenges. You might be tempted. Let's go ahead and, in fact, we'll scroll down. One of the things that I like about HDR Efex Pro is that it gives us a variety of previews that we can choose from in terms of what sort of effect we might want to apply. And this is beneficial for two reasons. Number one, it gives us a quick shortcut, you might say, to producing an interesting effect. So, I want to produce something like this, a very gritty with halos, and here's an even stronger halo. So to the question about these white halos, I suspect this is along the lines of what you're seeing. And we've got this grungy, gritty, noisy, textured appearance. or maybe I decide that I want some very colorful, interesting. So for the 1% of responders to the poll who said they want to bring it on and get as saturated and wild as possible, maybe this is a good starting point. But again, the point is that I have some starting points available to me. I think even more importantly, I have a little bit of creative inspiration here, because I might take a look at a preset, which, keep in mind, a preset is just saved settings from over on the right side. We'll take a look at that in a moment. But this is just an initial starting point. So it gives me some ideas of, oh, yeah, this looks kind of interesting, maybe a little too dramatic. That's interesting, but too bright and saturated. Maybe I'll start with a default, which is going to be a little bit closer to kind of a normal photographic image interpretation. But all of these presets are just saved settings from over on the right-hand side. So just think of them as starting points, but treat them as inspiration. Treat them as helping you to think about what options might be available. Then we can move over to the right side. And when you're getting ready, when you're thinking about which preset to use, another thing to keep in mind is that sometimes you'll find a preset that has only one real problem with it. So, I don't know, let's find an example here. There's a little bit flat. Maybe I like the contrast here, but the color is a little bit ridiculous. Or maybe I like this one because it's a little more muted, but it's too gritty and grainy. Try to keep in mind that because these presets relate to settings over on the right side, I can find a preset that I mostly like and then go fix the problem. So, for example, tuning down that severe effect that we were getting with this particular preset so we have a less gritty version. So try to look past the things you don't like about a preset. Try to identify what you do like and use that potentially as a starting point if you're not finding anything else. But I'll go back in this case to my default settings, and then we'll explore some of those options over on the right-hand side. All right, so then and I see there was a question actually, what is the slider beneath the preview in the previous dialog? That was actually an exposure. So keep in mind, exposure in terms of preview. Keep in mind, as I've said several times, when we're dealing with HDR, high dynamic range, we're dealing with a range of tonal values that goes way beyond what we're going to have in the final image. And so sometimes looking at that initial preview before the tone mapping has been applied can be a bit of a challenge. So there's a slider there that allows you to lighten or darken that preview so you can get a better sense of what information is actually there, that's actually going to be available later on in your workflow. All right, so let's say we found a preset that seems to be working pretty good. Now we can come over and look at our various options. So we'll start off in the tone compression section. Tone compression, we are compressing a very big range, a high dynamic range, into a normal range, you might say. We're taking all of this information that went beyond the capabilities of your camera and essentially squeezing that information in as though it was a single exposure. So we have a couple of options. We have an amount of tone compression. Increasing tone compression will reduce the overall contrast. Reducing tone compression will increase contrast, but it might also translate into losing detail, losing information in the highlights and or the shadows. Then we have method strength, which means how strongly do we want to apply the method. What's the method? Well, that's whatever we've defined down below. So I'll leave that set to 50%, the default value initially. Note that I can double click on a slider handle in order to reset any of those slider values. And now I can choose in terms of the depth. Do I want to turn that off, subtle, normal, or strong? And then the detail. Do I want soft, realistic, accentuated, detailed, or grungy? And then in terms of drama, again, a series of options. In some respects, you can think of this as being a slider value ranging between contrast, low contrast versus high, and detail, low detail versus high. And so we've got this kind of range. Do we want there to be a lot of detail? Do we want it to be grungy and gritty and grainy? Or do we want it to be somewhere in between? So we're interpreting the depth, in other words, the overall contrast levels, the amount of detail that we're pulling out. Do we want lots of shadow detail, or do we want a little bit more contrast in the scene? And then in terms of drama, do we want to make it really accentuated? Here, by the way, once again, the question about the white halos in the sky, this is a very classic example of that because we've pushed that drama too far. So I might leave that down at a lower level. But that's just defining, you might say, the style of that HDR method. Now I can also adjust the strength. Do I want that effect to be stronger, versus less strong in the overall image. So we've got a little bit of control there in terms of that, well, not a little bit, quite a bit of control, you could say, in terms of tone compression. And then we come into the overall tonality. So I've got exposure, shadows and highlights, a white and black point, and then contrast and structure. So the overall exposure, of course, we can brighten or darken the overall image. We can pull down the highlights to preserve more highlight detail, or if we want to brighten them up to make things look a little bit more realistic in terms of very bright highlights, I could open up some shadow detail. I tend, not always, but I tend toward darkening up my shadows just a little bit. Again, coming back to that little bit more realistic appearance in my HDR images. Contrast, I could boost that. I don't tend to use contrast very much. Instead, I'll use shadows and highlights combined with blacks and whites to affect my overall contrast range in the image. So I might darken down the shadow areas just a little bit. As needed, I could lighten or darken the highlight areas, paying attention to that histogram during the process. And then structure, if you're already using Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, you're familiar, I'm sure, with the clarity adjustment. Structure is very similar in many respects to the clarity adjustment. It's a little bit more sophisticated in some ways, perhaps less sophisticated in other ways, but point being is that it's very similar in terms of drawing out more detail or toning down, even making the image look a little bit more ethereal. Here I might increase that value just a little bit to accentuate some of the more subtle details in the image. So that's giving me a pretty good degree of control so far in terms of tonality, but let's turn our attention to the color. And this is one of those images that is a bit challenging when it comes to color. If I try to cool down the color temperature because of all that incandescent light, I start to get some kind of odd colors within the image. If I compensate for that green, it starts to get too magenta. It seems like no matter how I adjust these sliders, I'm just ending up with a not very good result, and that's in large part due to the fact that this scene had a lot of mixed lighting in it, and so that creates a particular challenge for me. And so generally when I start running into color problems like this, I start to think very seriously about black and white. So I'll neutralize, actually I'm not going to neutralize them just yet. Let me bring those sliders back to, somewhere around there so that we can see the color shift that's been applied. But then in this case, I might actually reduce the saturation of the image. And so here you can see, because I've desaturated, you would assume that I'm going to end up with a black and white image, except I've taken a black and white image and then applied adjustments for temperature and tint. So I've essentially added a tint to the image. You could think of this as split toning almost, or as adding a sepia tone type of effect. I'll just double click the slider handles for each of those controls, temperature and tint, to remove the color. And since I have saturation now at -100, I've created a black and white interpretation, which I think works a lot better for this image, in particular because of those challenges when it comes to trying to adjust for color when I've got a mixed lighting situation. I see, by the way, there's a question from one of the attendees today. Have you used HDR in camera using the in-camera software? And there's a number of cameras now that offer the ability to create in-camera HDR. And that's interesting and that can be very helpful. The problem is, in my experience, the software in the camera for creating an HDR doesn't do a very good job and doesn't give you much in the way of flexibility in terms of how that result is going to be interpreted. And so my personal preference in terms of a final HDR result is that I do not like to use the in-camera option. Having said that, I often tell photographers they ought to turn on HDR in the camera. So what's going on here? Well, the idea is that I don't want that in-camera HDR as my final result, but that in-camera HDR can be very helpful to you as a photographer to evaluate the results that at a very basic level, recognizing that you'll have more flexibility later in your workflow, but creating that HDR in camera. Most cameras will give you the option to keep the original raw captures and to keep the in-camera HDR so that on your camera's LCD display you can get a sense of the overall range, how things are working, evaluate your framing, your composition, and make adjustments accordingly. And then you'll be able to take the original RAWs and create your own interpretation of that HDR later in the process. So again, one of the things that I want to reinforce yet again in terms of the original values. So if I take the preset that we see on the left, I really want to underscore that those are just starting points. I can always come back and refine the settings over on the right-hand side. So treat those as a bit of creative inspiration and use the controls over on the right to really focus on creating the result that you're after. Now, speaking of creating the result that you're after, we can then assemble, compare the before and after essentially. I can click and hold the compare button to see the initial interpretation, the original image as it were, versus what I've produced. I can also view a split image. And so, for example, I'll choose this vertical split, and I've got the left side is the before, the right side is the after. I can rotate. If I click this arrow, I can rotate between splitting vertically versus horizontally, and then I can drag that preview slider left and right. So I can see most of the image in color, for example, versus black and white in this case. Now, speaking of that black and white, another question from one of the attendees: why would I use the software here, using HDR Efex Pro, to assemble my black and white interpretation of the image rather than using Silver Efex Pro, for example, or even saving that for Lightroom? And the answer is, in general, I would probably consider, actually not even consider, in most cases, under normal circumstances, if I wanted a black and white interpretation, I would indeed use something else for that purpose. In this case, though, there would not be much advantage from that because I don't have good color to start with. Instead, I've got this problematic, almost monochromatic look to the image. And so really, I think just stripping out the color altogether will work pretty well. But actually, we'll go ahead and take a look at an example of that when I might assemble the HDR and then create a black and white interpretation. So again, we have those previews. I also have a next to each other preview, kind of before and after sitting next to each other, either top to bottom or left and right, again with that little rotation button in the center. But for my money, I think that this dragging between before and after really works wonderfully well. So I'm a particular fan of that option. Note, by the way, I should hasten to point out, if you do find presets that you really like over on the left, you can click on the star icon for any of those presets, which will make it a favorite, so that you can switch to favorites very quickly. So we'll go ahead and create a preset in a second here. I can switch amongst the various categories of presets and then go to my favorites if I had identified any favorites at all. And so if, for example, I wanted to create my own preset that will preserve all of these various settings, if I decide that this is a good starting point, for example, then I could create a custom preset. So I'll click the plus symbol next to custom, and we'll just call this, Tim's black and white, just to give it something of a name, and choose OK. Here is my preset under custom. I can also add it to favorites by clicking that star. So when I'm in the preset library under favorites, there's my black and white interpretation. Now, there are some other adjustments available that allow us to apply some different effects. I'll go ahead and just cover those very briefly here. We have control points, so if I want to specify an area of the image, I'll go ahead and click the control point, click into the image, and so for example, I can brighten or darken specific areas. The control points are a little bit tricky. Sometimes they work great, sometimes not so great. Let me bring this out into the sky so you get a better sense, and we'll darken up the sky. So you can see that first of all, that control point is darkening in a circle in this case. I can move that circle, and by and large, not without exception, but by and large, if I move that control point closer to the building won't be adjusted and the sky will be, because I've sampled the sky. In this case, you can see it's actually bleeding into that building a little bit. I can also adjust the size of that area, but in many cases, you'll find that then that causes it to not be very selective. So maybe if I go to the tree, for example, it'll do a little bit better job of identifying just the tree rather than the surrounding areas. So if I try to enlarge that a little bit, I can get the tree, and I'm only having a very small effect elsewhere. So sometimes those control points work pretty well. Quite frankly, I find that they can be a little bit troublesome, and so when I think I need a control point, generally, I'll go ahead and just delete that control point. I would work in Lightroom or Photoshop for that final work. I do have the ability to apply a vignette, so I could, for example, darken the edges if I wanted to, change the shape. I can apply a graduated effect, and I can also apply levels and curves. Generally speaking, if I'm going this far into my adjustments for this HDR image, I would tend to save those adjustments for after the fact. So in this case, the color was just plain problematic, so I'm desaturating and working with this black and white version of the image right here. Most of these other adjustments, though, I would save for after the fact. I'll go ahead and apply those changes. We'll go ahead and save the result here, and then we'll take a look at one more example working with an image that I might want to convert to black and white, but that I would save in terms of that process for a little bit later. So here, by the way, is my HDR image assembled with HDR Efex Pro from Photoshop. And let's go find, in fact, we'll take a look at the barn image here. And that's one that I might want to convert to black and white, but that I would tend to use Lightroom or Photoshop for that purpose. So I'll go ahead and select those multiple images. Once again, go to the File menu, and then we're going to export with a preset using HDR Efex Pro as that selected export preset. Those individual images will then be sent out to HDR Efex Pro so that we can assemble them. And once that process is complete, then we'll be able to apply those same adjustments. And I think you'll find that with a little bit of practice, you start to get a much better sense of how you're going to work here, and you can work pretty quickly. I'll go ahead and do my chromatic aberration check. Let's get to some of these edge areas. And right about there. And again, with the chromatic aberration in particular, I like to swing through those extremes and then get a better sense of where the chromatic aberration might be and what it might look like. Here's that slider, by the way, so I can adjust that preview so that I'm able to see different areas. I can get a better sense of how much shadow detail is there, etc. So something like that to get a better sense of how much information is really contained within that range. So essentially this actually provides a good graphic. My overall exposures contain information all the way from -2 stops to +2 stops, but I can't really see all of that information in a single image without tone mapping, and so the slider allows me to get through and see all those various values. So I'll go ahead and create that HDR. Again, obviously we've gone through this process, and so even if I think that I don't want to keep all of the color, I will, in this case, keep that color just so we can show that closing piece of the workflow here. And so, again, keeping in mind that I'm assembling this HDR image and using HDR Efex Pro as my starting point for figuring out how much information I'm presenting, the overall interpretation of that HDR, I can still come back in Lightroom in this case and fine-tune the effect later. So just by way of example, we'll go through that process. And in terms of any particular tips for keeping the image looking natural, yes, absolutely. So a few of those, mostly avoiding common mistakes. So I'm going to start off with my default settings here. That looks to be a pretty good starting point. My histogram looks pretty good. So to avoid having an image look artificial, there are a few things. Number one, don't push the saturation. I know we have a tendency to say, oh, color is good, and color is part of the reason why I captured this image, so let's bring out some more color. And I want to try to get more detail. That's why we use HDR, is to get more detail out of the image, a little bit more sense of the context, the contrast, the texture. We can brighten up our shadow details so that we can see all that information, darken down the highlights so that we're not missing anything at all. Every little bit of detail is visible, and increase the structure. Well, we're working in reverse here, aren't we? So the question was, how do you avoid the artificial look? And I'm showing you exactly how to create that artificial look. But then the answer obviously is simply the opposite. So be careful about presenting too much detail, too much texture, too much saturation. I know those are part of the reasons. Information, detail, texture. These are reasons why we capture an HDR in the first place. It's an easy trap to fall into, but I would say that by and large, we don't want someone to look at our picture and say, oh, HDR, or worse, I see you're just learning how to capture HDR images. Instead, we're trying to maximize the amount of information available. And again, that's not always true. It's not true 100% of the time, but I would say clearly it was 84% of photographers who took the poll before we got started today, you wanted to create more natural looking images. And so be careful with your saturation. You might even darken the shadows, even though part of the reason for capturing an HDR image is to preserve shadow detail. You might actually darken those shadows a little bit to enhance contrast just a little bit. And again, bear in mind that in many respects, you can think of this HDR processing, the tone mapping, as just a starting point. Just as when we convert an image to black and white, we might still want to adjust contrast and add a color tint, etc. So too, when I've created a basic HDR image in an effort to preserve as much detail as possible, I might then want to come back into Lightroom and continue that process. So for example, regarding one of the questions before, we can convert to black and white with more control inside of Lightroom than we can really inside of HDR Efex. I could send this image over to Silver Efex if I prefer. I could simply convert to black and white and then come back down to my sliders, for example, and maybe I want to darken the barn a little bit, and maybe I'll darken up if there's any greens in there, we'll brighten those up, etc., etc. You get the idea. I'm able to play with this image a little bit and choose my interpretation, choose the degree to which I want to preserve highlight detail versus shadow detail, maybe boost the clarity, etc. Maybe in this case, I'll open up those shadows just a little bit more. But again, the point being is that I can treat this as an overall workflow, as an overall process, capturing my individual images out in the field and then assembling those into an HDR image, and even after I've created that HDR image, potentially being able to continue working, to continue applying my own creative interpretation for the image. One other question from an attendee, the slider in that preview. So we were looking at the preview slider, the light versus dark, when we're initially assembling our HDR. In fact, just for the sake of making that abundantly clear, we'll go ahead and I'll assemble an HDR here really quickly, just one more time. So again, to the File menu and then Export with a preset and then HDR Efex Pro. And so we're assembling, in this case, 7 exposures, taking a very dark exposure to preserve detail in the sun, all the way up to a very bright exposure to preserve detail in the wheat field and the abandoned farmhouse behind. So I'm taking all of that tremendous range of information and assembling it into a single high dynamic range image. Again, consider the tremendous range in terms of the overall tonal value. In this case, there was 7 stops of separation between the darkest and the brightest exposure. And so I can't really see all of that information until I've tone mapped. Well, if I want to get a better sense, I'll go ahead and slide over to the left here. That preview is still being assembled. I can get a better sense of how much detail we have in the sun. I can get a better sense of how much detail we have in the wheat. But that is just for preview purposes. When I actually create my HDR and I've assembled that result and I'm ready for my tone mapping stage, I'll still have full control over how that information is actually being interpreted. So again, think of that as a way for you to preview how much information is available in the overall HDR. You'll still have full control over that final result. We'll let that continue. It's merging the exposure. It'll take a little bit longer because there are, in this case, 7 exposures. In terms of correction of the original images before sending it to HDR Efex Pro 2, I tend not to actually process very much. I obviously don't need to adjust my exposures. I might apply some basic corrections, but generally speaking, most of that I'll save for processing in HDR Efex. What do I see? Let's see, the best HDR, camera, Lightroom, or all the other programs out there. What do I see that's the best? That's a tricky question, actually. I would say in-camera is probably your worst option. Again, we want to capture the multiple exposures, but assembling the HDR in camera, generally your worst option. Lightroom does a pretty good job. It's really, I would say, best for images that are very static, which is to say that while I like the workflow of creating my HDR images right inside of Lightroom, that doesn't work very well in terms of images with any degree of ghosting. So the workflow is nice, but the assembly is not there yet. But I promise you, I think we can bet that Adobe will continue improving that. So that will get better over time. Photomatix is a great tool for assembling HDR images. It is a little bit more complex, more complicated. HDR Efex Pro is more often than not my top choice. There are some situations where it might not work as well for a particular image. But that's actually one of the challenges here, because individual HDR software is going to do different jobs, but the results will vary based on the images. So you'll find one tool works better for certain images, others for other images. Generally speaking, I would say if I could only have one piece of software right now for assembling HDR images, it would be HDR Efex Pro with, my second choice would be, there's a couple of different options, but Photomatix would generally be my second choice. A little more complicated, but it's pretty powerful and produces great results. But I would say that very often I'll find myself switching between because for one image. So if you're doing a lot of HDR, I encourage you to test out the trial versions for the different software and see what's going to work best for you for a variety of different circumstances, because you will find that you get better results with certain software in certain circumstances versus other software for other circumstances. So unfortunately, not a simple answer, but if I could only pick one, it would be HDR Efex Pro. But I do love Photomatics, and the Lightroom workflow is pretty nice as well. So just to wrap things up, I want to point out here that you saw that I was previewing that tremendous dynamic range, and I slid my slider in the previous dialog all the way to the left, showing a very dark image. But as you can see, that's just a preview. That's just a way to preview the information in that HDR image before the tone mapping, but it's not changing what we get when we actually apply that tone mapping. So I'll just leave the default setting here as it is for this image. Obviously, I could then continue working with this image. Well, obviously, I could have continued working right here inside of HDR Efex Pro. I can continue doing work inside of Lightroom. As a general rule, I try to get at least my overall tonal range optimized in HDR Efex Pro, and then I'll save some of my fine-tuning and creative finishing work for Lightroom. All right, let's see. We've got a couple other questions here. In terms of, let's see, for higher ISO images, do you carry out your noise reduction in Lightroom before exporting? Generally speaking, I would say that processing the noise reduction on your final HDR image will work perfectly fine as compared to the original RAWs. I do, if I'm using long exposures, then I generally do enable in-camera long exposure noise reduction because that'll capture a dark frame. That will result in a doubling of your exposure time. If you take a 20-second exposure with your long exposure noise reduction turned on, the camera will take your 20-second exposure, but then it will also capture a 20-second exposure with the shutter closed so that it's not actually capturing any light in order to measure the behavior of the image sensor at that very moment. And so then you can apply, you're able to in camera, well, you're not, but the camera does this for you, to take that noise information and subtract it from the image. So that is something that I would take advantage of on longer exposures, but otherwise and I actually find that Lightroom does an exceptional job of noise reduction, and especially with more recent versions, it really does a very, very good job. And so I would tend to use Lightroom for that purpose. And processing after the fact in the develop module, after you've assembled your HDR image, is perfectly fine. Alrighty, so let's see, one more question perhaps. How do you know when it's better to use only 3 photos versus more photos? That's a really good question. So in the original captures, how do I know? You'll notice here, for example, that I have some sequences that were 3 exposures versus some sequences that were 7 exposures. That actually relates to the camera being used. The 3 exposures were for cameras that I was using previously that only offered automatic exposure bracketing for up to 3 exposures. So if I needed more than what that offered, I would separate each exposure of the 3 by 2 stops. So theoretically an even exposure, a -2 exposure, and a +2 exposure. But if that was not enough, then I would revert to manual mode and dial in as many exposures as I needed. Now that cameras have 5 and 7 and sometimes more exposures available for the automatic exposure bracketing, I've actually gotten in the habit of using 7 exposures, separating by 1 stop or 1.5 stops, and just capturing. Not worrying about, well, in this case, I only needed 3 exposures or 4 exposures. Yes, that means I end up with extra images, but it also means I don't have to worry about how many exposures to capture on the fly when I'm out in the field. So I've gotten to the point now that I'm using a camera that allows me, for example, to capture 7 exposures as part of the automatic exposure bracketing. I just leave that enabled at 7, even though I could turn it down to 3. I end up with more images than I need in many cases, but that way I just always have at least enough. All right, and then let's see, different details. So is it true that Nikon sensors preserve more shadow detail, but Canon preserves more highlights? I would say, as a general rule, probably not true entirely. There's some cameras that are going to do better in terms of shadow performance, highlight performance. We now have these highlight protection options in some of the cameras, noise reduction options. You will see different results depending on the software you're using, so that's really quite a moving target. All right, let's see if we have one more question here. So pushing and pulling exposures, virtual copies when you didn't shoot for HDR. Okay, so is it possible? Can I take multiple exposures? If I have a single image, let's say this was the only photo that I captured, can I process a version that's brighter and a version that's darker and come up with a better result? What I would say is not exactly a better result from a technical image quality standpoint, but you might find it easier to assemble in terms of the adjustments that you can apply. So if we've gone beyond the camera's capability, then we've gone beyond the camera's capability. But if we're very, very close, such as here, I can create one image. For example, I could create an interpretation of the image that's very bright, an interpretation of the image that's very dark, and I could indeed combine those into an HDR, but it's not a true HDR because we haven't actually expanded the range available. We're essentially performing tone mapping before we assemble the HDR instead of after. And so I would say is if you only have a single exposure, you're probably going to be just fine using, for example, Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw or other raw processing software to process that image, because you'll see with a raw capture, we do have a bigger range available than we might otherwise realize. So here, for example, I can pull back on the whites, I can push up on the blacks so that the default interpretation of this image meant that detail was being clipped, but I can actually, you might say, unclip that detail if I wanted to. So it is one of those tricks that you can take multiple versions of a raw capture, process multiple versions of the raw capture to create, for example, a series of TIFF images, one that's too dark, one that's just right, and one that's too bright, assemble those into an HDR. That's really just a shortcut for adjusting the image. If you find that easier in terms of creating the result you want, that's perfectly fine, but from a technical image quality standpoint, you're not really getting an advantage. All right, so not only have we reached the end of our time here today, but we've actually gone beyond that. So thank you very much to everybody who attended, who joined us for this discussion, this webinar about HDR Efex Pro. I hope that that is very, very helpful. In the meantime, thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you'll join us for a future webinar in the GreyLearning Webinar Series, and we'll see you then.